Hello folks, Lisa here again. We've had to postpone Cottesloe Part 2 briefly while we look at London Court in the city. So we're back in Perth City today, just briefly. Consider this as an appendix to Cottesloe Part 2, where we look at Mr. Claude de Bernales and his association with London Court. So because London Court was back in the city and way too much to put into Cottesloe Part 2, we'll do this as standalone, and that's another tick box from the city. I hope you enjoy. I had fun with this one.
Wake up and listen.
So whilst searching for information about de Bernales and London Court, this article from Dodgy Perth came up. An architectural monstrosity. Batty Library again. People dressed in West Australia's traditional costume. No. If asked to list Perth's 10 worst buildings, this office would definitely include London Court. A cut-price Disneyland Tudor street scene, it was erected in 1937 by shady miner Claude de Bernales. How bad does a building have to be to get condemned from the pulpit? Rev. Iona Williams described it as so ugly, London Court was an offence against God himself. Preaching at Trinity Congregational Church, the good Reverend said the arcade was an admission that architects had no original ideas. Architecture should be about the now, not a repetition of the past. I don't know if I agree, but I'll keep going. But what would a theologian know? Let's get the opinion of an architect. A poor imitation of Tudor architecture, the architect spluttered, before lashing out at the ridiculous Punch and Judy clock. When archaeologists of the future excavate the arcade, he said, they will be baffled as to why it was erected in the first place. In any case, a good archaeologist would immediately rebury the monstrosity. Interesting take. Warming to his theme, the architect demanded to know where it would all end. A leaning tower of Pisa outside the GPO, Stonehenge on the Esplanade. In a blistering conclusion, he said the only thing that should be doing impressions is a monkey, and a monkey would probably have made a better job of London Court anyway. As you can see, London Court has been much loved ever since it was erected. Goodness, now let's see what they've got to say about Mr. Bernales himself. The scam artist who built London Court. Looking well shady. If he's remembered at all, Claude de Bernales is famous for having built the gaudy mock Tudor shopping arcade London Court. Described as a mining promoter and investor, he is also said to have been larger than life. Those who lost their savings in his fraudulent schemes would have called him a con man. Flashy and egotistical, de Bernales was one of the biggest personalities ever to set foot in Perth. But he gambled on gold in a big way and lost other people's money, that is. In his youth, de Bernales was well known on the goldfields. Travelling the dusty fields on a push bike, he would arrive at a mine and put on a spotless shirt and collar before presenting himself to the manager to sell his machinery. Before World War I, he bought up as many derelict mines as he could. Some were flooded, few were workable. After the war, de Bernales created a labyrinth of interlocking companies and floated his mines on reports of old workings. Only one mine, Yellowdine, ever paid dividends, but even that failed to live up to its promise. In a classic Ponzi scheme, interest in his numerous companies was kept alive by dividends drawn from Yellowdine. At his peak, de Bernales' office was adorned with Flemish tapestries African mahogany panelling, and a luxury bathroom lined with marble. Visitors were offered the best cigars and liquors. However, in 1939, 8 of his companies were barred on the London Stock Exchange. He faced many stormy shareholder meetings where he indignantly denied allegations of fraud. But when Scotland Yard sent 2 detectives in 1946 to Australia to investigate, the whole rotten scheme came to a sudden end. A man who built an empire entirely made of smoke and mirrors also built London Court. What a surprise. So I've had my suspicions for a long time about London Court, and not because of the style of it, because of the basement, the age of it, etc. And I thought, well, let's check what evidence we actually have. So you could suggest that a set of plans would denote that it was definitely built at the time they're saying, 1937, I believe. But whether it was a rebuild or a redo or just a makeover, whatever it was, there would have been plans drawn. So I started looking at references. I don't know if you've ever done this on Wikipedia, but it often leads very much the same result. Let's see which of these actually open. Nope, not that one. Not that one. Not that one. Not that one. And not that one. Okay, so we're not going to rely on Wikipedia. I'll come back to this page. Looking at Heritage Perth, their view on London Court, they quote as their sources the Sunday Times newspaper, Western Mail newspaper, the Western Argus newspaper, Kalgoorlie Miner newspaper, and Kalgoorlie Miner from when it actually opened. So there's no evidence for this alleged gun alley that was there before. And then I'm looking at the, Heritage Council of Western Australia. I'll read from that. So we're looking for evidence. London Court is a 2-storey shopping arcade and office complex connecting St George's Terrace and Hay Street. It is built in the interwar Old English style. London Court was erected on land purchased in February 1936 on the site of a collection of back alleys known as Gun Alley. Source for that is 2. Let's look at 2 before we go any further. 2 is a book by K. Ward, published by Rigby, Perth Sketchbook. So I looked at that. Perth Sketchbook, published in 1966. Okay, so how old was the sketch that they're going on? So they're going on, there was a gun alley there before because there was a sketch drawn that wasn't published until 1966. Paul Rigby, is it the same Paul Rigby? Where does it list? Somewhere it lists his works. Sketch. There it is. Same person presented the sketchbook series. So Paul Rigby wasn't born until 1924. So that made him 13 when it was built. And he lived in Victoria anyway. Then he was with the Air Force. And then he works for the Western Mail in 1948. Worked as an artist and teacher before moving to Perth. So he did a sketch of it somewhere around the 50s, and that's the evidence we go on. Let's move on and see what else checks out. Where did we get up to? Gun Alley. The land was purchased from T.G.A. Malloy. Mr. Malloy again. Thomas George Anstruther Malloy. We've already visited him in part 1. Purchased from him by Claude de Bernales for the Australian Machinery and Investment Co. for the sum of £75,000. The idea of an arcade to provide a thoroughfare between St George's Terrace and Hay Street was conceived by de Bernales as an important link between Perth Railway Station in Wellington Street and the Esplanade. London Court would, via Sherwood Place to the south and through the new Plaza Arcade to the north, provide a direct north-south connection for pedestrian traffic through the city. Yeah, okay, that's an interesting theory. They could have just used either streets, William or Barrack, but anyway. De Bernales established London Arcades Limited to manage the project and commissioned Bernard Evans of Melbourne to design the arcade in association with local consulting firms Oldham, Boas and Edney Brown. We've already looked at Mr. Oldham. Blah, blah. Work commenced on London Court in August 1936 and construction was completed in 1937. The cost of the arcade was £100,000 and it comprised 53 shops, 55 offices and 24 residential flats. London Court was designed in an imitation Tudor style with huge wrought iron gates at each entrance and half-timbered walling to the arcade. The walls featured ornamentations of hand carvings, gargoyles, masks, shields, crests, and wrought iron signs and brackets. The gabled roofs, weathercocks, and lead lighting also contributed to the creation of a Tudor style. Terracotta tiles were laid in a crazy effect on the floor of the arcade to suggest ancient cobblestones. A special feature of both St George's Terrace and Hay Street frontage were the clocks, which dominated the entrances. Above St George's Terrace was the St George slaying the dragon. The dial was a reproduction of the La Grosse Horage of Rouen. Above the Hay Street entrance, the dial of the clock was a replica of the face of Big Ben in St Stephen's Tower of the House of Parliament in London. Both clocks were animated and figures moved in and out to celebrate the chiming of the quarter, half and full hour. The clocks were made by Cinechrome Company of London. I'm not sure if we need this. I did want to talk about London Court was opened on the 29th of July 1937 by Lieutenant Governor Sir James Mitchell in the presence of the Premier J.C. Wilcock and the Minister for Mines and Health, S.W. Munsey, and other notables. That the place was an important affirmation of British culture was confirmed in the opening, where Lieutenant Governor James Mitchell said that we, Australians, pride ourselves on being intensely British, not anymore, and in his opening speech he commented that London Court was unique in Australia and that it would be an ornament to the city. During the ceremony, this is just ridiculous, Mitchell unveiled 2 plaques, one commemorating the ceremony and the other giving a brief history of the building. After an inspection of the arcade, the official party and 90 guests assembled at a luncheon held in the basement restaurant of the arcade. This restaurant resembled an old English tavern with huge wooden pillars and I don't know what that means, roof supports. I better look up what that means. In his toast at the luncheon, Munsey described London Court as a romantic oasis from the artificial bonds of our lives. In many of the speeches, London Court was depicted as a place of escape from the modern world to a more romantic and simpler past, as a respite to a time where man was happier and where, despite social evils and plagues, there was real valour, deep passions and wandering thought. It was claimed that the shopping arcade would be an oasis in the desert of our materialism. Oh dear, because save us from materialism with a shopping arcade. Ah dear. The opening of London Court was celebrated with a 3-day Ye Olde English Fair. Is that how you say that? Fair? Which was held in conjunction with the official opening, which raised $2,000 for the Perth Hospital. Go the benevolent foundations. The West Australian reported that the event attracted thousands of visitors who were treated to the sight of volunteers and helpers dressed in Elizabethan-style costumes. The fair was followed by evening dramatic programs and musical items, including excerpts from Twelfth Night, madrigals, and folk songs. A bit of the old kumbaya. Appley and Irving described London Court as a richly detailed Tudor pastiche, proclaiming the prosperity that followed the Great Depression. The imagery espoused by buildings such as London Court harkened back to a time of adventure and prominence in English history. I don't think I need to go on any further. It remains much the same. We'll look at a few of the details and do a walkthrough. So this is where it is. As you can see, it's very long and very narrow, which was one of the things that made me suspicious about it in the first place, because a lot of other buildings are combining much wider blocks or previously narrow blocks, put back together. She also has some pretty ornate chimneys in there. And as for the line, of providing a thoroughfare from the station, yes, we can go from the Plaza Arcade, which is here, also Claude de Bernales, I've only just worked out, through London Court, down Sherwood Court, which there wasn't a lot down here at that time, I don't think. I may be wrong. To get to the station here, you still had to go through what's now Myer, but would have back then been the Bones buildings. Bowens. So back on the State Heritage site, just briefly, despite the Tudor style, London Court was a thoroughly modern building for its time. Although no effort or expense has been spared in the endeavour to reproduce a replica of an old English street, the new structure has been built of steel and concrete. Wait, are you sure about that? Survey says... Okay, moving on. So I spent some time scouring old images looking for if there was any site of this so-called gun alley that used to be in the spot where London Court is now. And I'm able to spot there's a big dome on top of this building. I don't know exactly what that building is yet. I will get to it. And from one of the photos I can see this building, but I can't see what's in there at all. It doesn't depict the front of the building at all. So, and the other images looking west on St George's Terrace where the arrow is, and then from the other direction looking east down St George's Terrace, and I can't tell what's there, and I kind of think that's deliberate. Interesting, very interesting. Anyway, we'll look at this page. This page is quite amusing as well. It seems that everyone wants to have a shot at London Court. So, Life on Perth, recreating a street scene from Elizabethan England, this Tudor-style arcade is just like the real thing. Only purists will complain about the absence of heavy fog, bubonic plague, and dull overcast skies. So we know who it was built by. The walkway is adorned with ornate window boxes, now with artificial flowers, because the real plants were causing water damage. Crests, gargoyles and moulded ceilings. Perth was established as a British colony in 1829. Western Australia has always had strong cultural links with Britain, and these values were embodied in the Tudor architecture of London Court. Today, Perth is a multicultural city, though in 1937 the community passionately embraced all aspects of British lifestyle. The construction of London Court also reflected an element of British stoicism, as our economy was still emerging from the dark days of the Great Depression. Technically Tudor. To the casual observer, London Court is a 20th century example of a Tudor-style architecture applied to an open-air shopping arcade. 20th century revival would be on the money. However, interwar Old English, mock Tudor, or even Tudorbethan would all see you through to the next round. We'll have a look at the Copper Galleon as we walk through. Keep an eye out for the statues of Sir Walter Raleigh and Dick Whittington. They are situated high on the inside of the walls at each end of the gallery. I had to remind myself who Dick Whittington was. Luckily, Wikipedia came to the party there. Dick Whittington and his cat. So, according to English folklore surrounding the real Richard Whittington, wealthy merchant and later Lord Mayor of London, the legend describes his rise from poverty-stricken childhood and the fortune he made through the sale of his cat to a rat-infested country. Now, I immediately had a low opinion of Mr. Whittington, because who would sell their cat? What sort of a person does that? And then looked at my desk, where you'll see my two. I can't get a moment's peace. So these are the clocks. Shop around the clocks. We have St. George and the Dragon in one, modelled, as I said previously, on the Clock in Ruin and Big Ben. And the other one has jousting knights. So they circle around, and apparently, look closely and you can see the losing knight fall backwards from his horse. I've never stood around to bother. But anyway, the Elizabethan experience is authentic though bucket loads of household waste are no longer poured from the upper level windows. Complaints from passing tourists and smartly dressed business people soon ended this rather hit and miss tradition. The Tudor windows remain faithful. They comprise of many small panes of glass, each individually framed in a lattice pattern. In Tudor times, large sheets of glass were difficult to assemble, so the panes were small and held in place by lead frames. London Court originally included 24 residential units, which were thoroughly modern for 1937. They contained early air conditioning units and were smart wired for astounding new technologies such as radios, telephones, and electric toasters. Smart wiring 1937 style meant that power outlets were located near the empty bench space. It was forward thinking, though the people of Perth were not yet ready to swap large residential blocks for confined inner city living. The units have since been converted into office space and storage area for the shops. And this, I saw this and this kind of got my hackles up. An Old English tavern once occupied the large basement area below the St. George's Terrace end of London Court. It was decorated in the Elizabethan style and specialised in serving grilled food. Today, the basement is used by a fantasy and wargaming store. Don't let the rather spooky-looking creature on the wall of the basement stairwell put you off. It did put me off. I didn't want to go down there and see what was down there. They may suspiciously resemble figures associated with the Knights Templar, though we can confidently assure potential ark hunters it isn't down there. We looked. So we'll have a quick look at the real thing before we move on. Okay, so here we are. That's the first Punch and Judy clock. You'll hear it in a minute. Sorry if this footage is a bit rough. It's my phone and it doesn't focus too well. There's your copper galleon. Basement down there. Sorry, yes, that's my finger. Oldie worldy lift. It's very narrow. Hard to imagine that they were having any kind of theatre in there. It is on a bit of a slope though. I did hate it. I've always hated it. I always thought it just looked so ridiculous, but I am warming to it now. Now that I've had such a good laugh over it. That would be Mr. Whittington and his cat up there, I believe. You can't have your cat and sell it too. Stairs going up to the offices. Thames Legal. Yeah, there was a strange person talking to themselves, and then there's have a chat on the phone. She keeps chatting all the way down. I came through at this time thinking it would be fairly quiet. I think that goes into the arcade next door. Oldie worldy charm. The other way, directly behind me there, just head straight back out to the street. The tiles are gone. That's the scary place. I looked at it when it was open one day and I went, nah, I don't want to go in there. Another copper galleon on the roof there. And that's Sherwood Court that heads down to the river. The other Punch and Judy clock. They always reminded me of Punch and Judy. That's her. Beautiful, picturesque London court. Okay, I'll catch you in Cottesloe Part 2 coming up very soon. Thanks for joining me. Catch you later.